Okay. Hey, everyone. Hey, please keep yourself muted. We are recording this program, so after this presentation, please visit our YouTube channel, hit subscribe, and smash that like button, and click the bell to get all our new content. That really helps us out. Welcome to another educational and inspiring AAM program. This entitled Research-Based Strategies for Activists, Overcoming Futility and Other Psychological Hurdles. When doing outreach to the public, animal advocates focus on convincing people that farming animals is harmful. But new research shows that this isn't what is stopping people from aligning with the animal rights movement. Aidan Kankyoku from Pax Fauna will present research-based recommendations about how advocates can overcome the most common psychological hurdles when doing outreach. So my name is Michelle Granberg. I'm your moderator. I'm a mentor and team member with Animal Activism Mentorship. I'm located in New Jersey, and I've been a vegan and activist for over 6 years. Our mission at AAM is to empower our fellow humans to take action and equip them with what they need to fight for animal liberation. AAM is here to teach specific tools and lay a strong foundation for activists at all levels on which their activism will stand for years to come. We offer a 3-month free mentorship program that pairs experienced activists with aspiring activists. Through one-on-one mentoring, we generate an increased number of effective activists worldwide because we know this movement needs more activists. Additionally, we offer free workshops that train and educate our mentors, mentees, and the public on various aspects of animal rights activism. We have a podcast called the Animal Liberation Hour, and we host large-scale in-person activism events. AAM is proud to be fueled by FARM, the Farm to Animal Rights Movement, one of the oldest AR organizations in the country. If you're interested in applying to become a mentor or mentee, or to get involved or to donate, please visit our website, animalactivismmentorship.com. Follow both AAM and FARM on social media. Okay, that being said, I want to introduce our speaker. Since getting their start as a community organizer with Direct Action Everywhere in Colorado in 2015, Aidan has been immersed in studying the craft of disruptive mass movements. Besides spending years organizing in the animal freedom movement, Aidan has gained a broad perspective on mass movement, building through hands-on experience at the Standing Rock protests in South Dakota, Extinction Rebellion in London and elsewhere. They have spent years seeking out new tools and methods for organizing in order to lay the groundwork for Pax Fauna and a new mass movement for animal freedom. Okay, so please hold your questions until the Q&A interactive portion. We'll let you know. Then you can raise your hand or put questions in the chat. And again, just keep yourself muted for now. So I'm going to pass it over to Aidan now. Aidan, go ahead, take it away.
All right, thanks so much, Michelle. We're really excited to be on with everyone. Thank you all so much for coming. I'm going to go ahead and just kind of jump right into the content, except for that I'll kind of preface that the flow of this is going to be, do some slides for probably about 20 minutes, maybe less. And then we'll have a section that's a little bit more conversational around a specific kind of aspect of what I'll be presenting. And then we might go back into some slides and present some more stuff before a more kind of open and Q&A at the end. We'll kind of see how time is going through that. And we're aiming to be done around 90 minutes. So now 80 minutes from now. So just a kind of a heads up of what to expect. So all that said, can I get some thumbs ups if you can see my screen? Okay, looking good. So we're going to be talking about a big research project that I worked on with my team at Pax Fauna. And as I was hearing the title that we gave for the talk again about overcoming futility, I noticed it could sound like, oh, that sense of futility that we might have, and that's maybe a day for a talk for another day. This is about, overcoming common kind of things that we hear from the public when we're doing outreach, or the common kind of things that are stopping members of the general public from getting more on board with the goals of animal advocates. So like we've all heard, probably the vegan bingo cards and like seeing like, oh, we all know like these common objections that are kind of come up. And a lot of those things are going to come up in this presentation. We're going to see that, maybe a lot of the things I'll have to say are not totally unfamiliar, but hopefully the way that I can change the way that we sort of think about them, and how we situate them in our advocacy, and also how we respond to them. So jump right in. Oh, there we go. Just say a little word about Pax Fauna first. It's a pretty new organization, and we are mostly people who came out of years of experience as grassroots organizers in the animal movement, mostly with DXE, also with other groups. And we sort of decided after a while to step back from that frontline work for a little bit and do some research to try to, kind of take some time, digest what we had learned in all of our experiences, and do some original research to see if we could kind of improve our approach. And one big part of that was messaging research, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. We've also been doing research on kind of thinking about strategy, and also kind of internal organizing methods, how we organize within our communities that can be more effective. So those are some other work streams that we have, but today we're going to be focusing on this messaging research. And jumping right into it, we got the inspiration or the desire to do some research on public opinion about animal rights and messaging, because we noticed some really interesting discrepancies, or just some interesting signals, let's say, in surveys that have come out over the last 10 years on animal rights questions, specifically among the US public, so on the one hand, there were these surveys coming out that found really surprisingly high levels of support for these really bold pro-animal statements, like all animals should have the same rights as humans. You got a third of people saying they agree with that, or up as many as almost half of people saying that they would support banning slaughterhouses or factory farms. A third of people saying they would support a total ban on animal farming in these kind of surveys, which is kind of striking because obviously most people are not, reflecting that in their personal consumer choices. And in those same surveys, we do, get affirmation of that of those people who just said all those things, 97% of the same sample of people agree with the statement that eating animals is a personal choice, and no one should be able to tell me whether or not I can do it. And also in real practice, there's been no apparent real increase in vegetation. It's pretty difficult to measure, and different surveys come back, but I tend to fall more on the pessimistic side and say that the data seems to suggest that there hasn't really been an increase in total vegetarianism over the last couple decades. So how do we square the circle here? On the one hand, there's all these people expressing really strong support for ideas of animal rights, and on the other hand, it's not really panning out in terms of their personal behavior. And our study was kind of designed around the assumption that one reason for this might be what we call framing. And framing is basically, we could call it patterns in language, how we talk about issues, and different ways that we talk about issues, different patterns in the words that we use can change the way that we think about them. And that's probably kind of a no-brainer. But the interesting thing about framing is that, it can be, this obvious example is glass half empty, glass half full. Like that's pretty straightforward, but framing can be a lot more subtle than that as well. This is maybe another non-subtle example. Frozen yogurt is 80% fat free. It sounds like it's not a lot of fat, but it's 20% fat. Maybe it sounds like a lot of fat. But an even more subtle example is just to throw out some random examples of framing. Got a sale on laptops. One says it's 20% off versus another that says $120 off. These might have really different effects on how we receive this information, even though on the surface they're saying the same thing. 20% might kind of draw attention to the high starting price of the laptop, where the $120 off is like, we're just picturing that money in our pocket. So haven't done a study to say that that's how we would interpret those particular things, but you get the point. So coming back to the animal rights issue, it was actually kind of evident when we looked at these seemingly contradictory survey results. And I'll just reiterate, when I first saw these results, I thought, oh, this is a total contradiction, and people have so much like cognitive dissonance, and how do they not realize that there's like this huge contradiction in what they're saying? But it turns out that contradictions like that are really common in people's political opinions on all kinds of different issues, not just animal rights. And a lot of research literature attributes a lot of that discrepancy to this idea of framing. So in the questions that these surveys were asking, we can see the kind of beginnings of this. And if we look at the second example, the actual language in the survey was, whether or not to be a vegetarian is a personal choice, and no one should tell me what they think I should do. No one has the right to tell me what they think I should do. 97% of people agreeing with that statement. Well, there's a lot of values loaded into that statement, right? Personal choice, it brings up this consumer image. We in our research, we call this the consumer frame, and it's kind of the dominant way that people have of thinking about their relationship to food. It's the dominant way that Americans are used to thinking about food, is as consumers. They picture themselves at the grocery store, deciding what to buy. It brings up strong values of freedom and autonomy and personal choice. And, they're just kind of objectively right. I mean, it's true right now that what to buy at the grocery store is their personal choice, and no one can stop them. So we thought we have a pretty good understanding of what frames these kind of underlying patterns in speech and thinking are shaping the opposition to our goals as animal advocates. Like, where are people coming from when they don't support us? It's this consumer perspective. But we thought, we don't really know, where are these other answers coming from, these pro-animal movement perspectives? What frames, underlying kind of patterns and thinking, beliefs and values are being activated, and so what's going on under the hood in their brains when they're saying these pro-animal responses to surveys? So we designed a study to try to investigate that. And I'm just going to skim over this. I promise we'll just get into the findings very quickly here. But basically, it consisted of 5 stages. We looked at all the existing research on public opinion of animal farming. We analyzed the narratives and messages currently being used, not only by animal advocates, but also by animal exploiting industries in their advertisements and things like that, and by journalists and the media, who are kind of this, not on either side of the issue, but they have their own agenda. So what are the kind of all the different stories that people are telling about this, and all the ways they're talking about it? And based on those things, we designed some qualitative research. So we interviewed a lot of people. First, one-on-one, we interviewed about 80 people for 30-minute interviews over many months, kind of iterating over rounds of interviews, honing in deeper and deeper on what the kind of interesting themes were that were coming out. And then we switched to groups. So instead of just interviewing people one-on-one, we would get groups of 2 to 5 people and have them talk about the issue and kind of see how they were talking about it. And this was a setting where we could really kind of see ordinary members of the general public talking through their views on the issue of animal farming in a safe place where they felt, they weren't being judged. And again, probably a lot of the things that we heard are things that you all have heard, but we were able to do this in a more kind of controlled setting in a systematic way. And we eventually came up with a lot of ideas and findings, and we finally tested those in a national survey. And actually, we're continuing to design some more survey type experiments based on all of this. So, and you can read a lot more about this on our website if you want to scrutinize the methods. Okay, so finally we can get into the basic gist of what all of this means and how I'm hoping it can help you all in your outreach to the public. So I'm going to sort of tell a story about what's happening right now in the movement and where we could go to maybe be more impactful. So currently, animal advocates focus a lot of our messaging energy on convincing people that animal farming is a problem. We talk about the harms to animals, we talk about the harms to the environment, and we talk about the harms to health. You've probably heard there's, you know, debates within animal advocacy and among researchers about which of those three areas is maybe more effective to focus on, but all of those is about, you know, the harms of the industry. And what we found is that by and large, people were already consider animal farming harmful. They're already aware that it's harmful. There's room for more knowledge about the environmental harms, and the health harms are contested. But especially the harms to animals was the most, I mean, we just, almost everyone we talked to had seen footage of animals inside of slaughterhouses and factory farms, and they knew that this was a problem and that it goes against their values. So no one needed to be convinced really that this is a problem. And what we found instead is that there's a lot of layers. Like, so if people already think that, you know, what's stopping them from already being animal advocates, right? And we kind of found a lot of layers that people would kind of go through. So I'm going to talk through each one of these. I'll talk through them briefly right now, and then we'll go into each one of them in more depth. Well, actually, we'll mostly just go into the latter two in more depth. So the first stage, so kind of move from left to right here, is avoidance. And it was kind of amazing how many people that we brought in for interviews said some version almost exactly of the words, "I try not to think about it." So they know about the suffering the animals experience in modern agriculture, and they know that it goes against their values, and they know that if they think too hard about it, they're not going to want to eat meat for a while. So they try not to, because you know, it's inconvenient and it's uncomfortable to think about. So people are actively and consciously engaged in avoiding the issue. And again, this probably might not come as a surprise to many of you, but they talk about, you know, being at the grocery store and just needing to compartmentalize. But in the context of this study and in other contexts, people are willing to kind of set that avoidance aside if they're, you know, really asked to, and think about the issue. And when they do that, they're deeply ambivalent, right? They're deeply conflicted about it. So on the one hand, they're aware of the suffering of animals and they have seen the footage and they're deeply uncomfortable about all of that and it goes against their values. And on the other hand, they're deeply attached to eating meat for a number of reasons, that, you know, taste and things, but it also goes beyond taste. And so they would dwell in this ambivalence for a while, and they would, you know, talk about, maybe start to indicate, oh, I know it's really a problem. But there was this, there was a sense that there was kind of this practiced thing going on, like they'd thought about this before, right? And so justifications would start coming up, and so that would go to this third layer. And those are those things like taste, where they would start to lean on what are the things that they've thought about in the past to tell themselves that it's okay to keep using animals and eating animals. And we're going to talk about a bunch of those in a moment. But so even some of them were more effective, some of them were less effective. But people, even just, you know, we were in this kind of interview setting where we weren't really trying to challenge people yet on their views. We were just trying to draw them out. Like, what are they thinking by themselves? And oftentimes, you know, someone could bring up a justification and kind of scrutinize it a little bit, and they'd say, that's not very convincing. You know, that actually doesn't really make a lot of sense. It's not good enough. But there was one justification that just, when it came up, it was almost like that was the end of the conversation. Like there was a really effective way for people to rationalize their decision to continue eating meat. It kind of stood out from the crowd, and that was futility, which is why it kind of gets its own category here, because it just felt like it was the end of the conversation, kind of with most of these interviews that we did. Once the futility came up, stopped feeling productive. And basically futility was, well, let me see if I have a slide about now. Okay, we'll get there in a second. Yeah, so we'll talk more about futility in a second. So if you accept this kind of layers model that I have going on here, the thing is, ambivalence is where we want people to be. Like, that's the sweet spot where they are. A dissonance would maybe be another word for it. They're experiencing that cognitive dissonance, and there's an opportunity when they're in that state of mind to convince them to rethink their previous conclusions. So when people are in avoidance, we're trying to get them to think about it, and that's ambivalence. But when they think about it, they have these other rehearsed things that they're used to thinking. So when they're dealing with justifications or futility, which is like the ultimate justification, we're just trying to get them from, we're trying to address futility first, and then when they have these justifications, we're trying to address the justifications so that we can get them back to ambivalence, which is really where we want, and that's the sweet spot. So we're going to talk about how to do that a little bit. Well, the avoidance one's pretty straightforward. So we're going to talk about justification and futility, how to get people out of those. All right, all good? Here we go on. Okay, so justifications. Again, none of these will be things that I'm guessing everyone on this call will have heard all of these before. Culture and tradition. Let me pause that. All these things are things that we've probably heard before, and we've probably heard them a lot of times, and we're probably pretty annoyed by hearing them. And I'm even guessing that everyone on this call has kind of heard the idea that, like, well, yeah, okay, we've heard these things a lot, and it's frustrating, but we need to come with empathy, and we need to sort of remember that, like, for, we're hearing it for the 10,000th time, but like, this is this person, maybe they're saying it for the first time, or this is the first time that they're really having this conversation. What I want to just really kind of drill down on is, like, these are the things that are stopping people. It's like actually true. I think sometimes when we're hearing these, well, I'll speak for myself. When I've been doing outreach and I hear these things, it feels like deflections. It feels like they're kind of trying to avoid the core issue. Like, I was trying to talk about, the suffering of this animal in this video right now, and you're trying to deflect with culture or naturalness or whatever. The point that I want to make from our research is that actually these are like the sincerely held misgivings that people have that are holding them back from fully embracing their value alignment that would really lead them, as we all know, to what we're doing and what we believe. So these are things that we really need to take seriously and even start to think about more proactively addressing them. Because when we don't address these things in our messaging or in our outreach, what we heard from our study participants was that it kind of makes animal advocates and vegans seem out of touch. Like, it seems like we don't share the same concerns that other people have. So what I'm advocating for is that we really think about leaning into understanding that these are real, sincere views that people are holding that are holding them back from embracing our movement. So we're going to talk about how to maybe approach them. But first, let's just look at what they are. So you probably had a chance as I was just rambling for several minutes to read this whole slide, but I'll just skim over it anyway. Culture, this example quote here. I think there are some dishes that have cultural, there's funny ways that people talked about these things, but cultural foods. I don't think I'm an awful person for, staying connected. People would talk about, I was raised that way. They have all this nostalgia for the foods that they grew up with. So culture and tradition is a big one. Naturalness, another really big one. The idea that, like, our ancestors evolved eating meat, and it's this huge part of who we are, and it's what keeps us close to nature. People even kind of grieving, like, how disconnected from nature we've gotten, and they feel that eating animals is one way that they actually stay close to nature, or this connection with their ancestors. Taste, straight up, a lot of people are willing to admit that it just tastes so good and they don't want to give it up. And then health concerns. Again, I mentioned, people have heard the idea that plant-based is healthier. They've also heard the idea that it's not. We might talk about this a little more much later on in the talk, but like they have to wade through all this conflicting information, and then it's really hard and overwhelming for them. And so people have gotten to a point where they don't really trust. It's hard for them to trust different sources, and they don't know who to trust up for health information because they've heard such conflicting information about all kinds of different things, not just eating animals. A couple that aren't on this slide. Cost is a really common one. Personal choice. Well, I think we'll talk more about those a little bit later. So, as I said before, people would bring up these justifications. So they'd be in the ambivalence, the dissonance. They'd be saying, "Oh, I really don't feel good about what happens to animals, but but it's natural. I mean, we shouldn't give it up. We evolved this way." It adheres to the natural order of things, where people would talk about the cycle of nutrients, or the food cycle, or whatever, the food chain. but maybe they could talk themselves out of those things, and they would see that they were kind of weak. And then they would come to futility. So like basically futility sounds like it doesn't matter what I do. I'll read these quotes out too. So futility sounds like it doesn't matter what I do because there's so many other, it doesn't matter if I go vegan because there's 7 billion other people and they're not going to go vegan. And my individual impact as a consumer, if I go vegan, it just isn't going to make a difference. So I might as well keep eating meat if I enjoy it anyway, even if I think it's wrong, because it just isn't going to matter what I do because the world's never going to change. So there's 2 parts of that, right? One is my individual impact as a consumer, isn't worth me making a personal sacrifice. And part 2 is, and that's all that I can't even imagine that the whole rest of the world is going to change. So all I can really see is my consumer change. So a couple example quotes will say, I feel like corporations are so huge. They have so much power. What is a normal person like me to do? The second one, basically what I was saying, I guess I could be less of a hypocrite and become vegan or something, but realistically, that's not going to offset anything else. There would have to be a large percentage of the population becoming vegan. Sure. So next slide is, and see if I want to, say a little bit more about this. So I mentioned the consumer frame earlier, and that's this idea that people are kind of accustomed to thinking about food issues in general, and that includes their relationship with animal rights through a consumer lens. So they're only thinking about themselves as consumers, their relationship to the company that sells them food. They're picturing themselves at the grocery store or at a restaurant, deciding what to buy. And this, so I keep using the word frame, or I talked about framing earlier, and the idea of a frame gets its name from the fact that it puts some information in focus, and it also excludes other information. So there's within the frame, within the consumer frame is, that consumer choices, which those are all real things, people making choices about what to buy. And even, we could, from the consumer frame, you can try to argue, consumers do have power, like what you want to buy influences what gets produced. But it's keeping a lot of information out of the frame too, right? Which is the role that government policy plays in deciding what food choices are available to people to make, in subsidizing animal agriculture to make it less expensive than it, artificially inexpensive, so that people are more likely to make those choices. The role of corporate policy. So there's lots of things that aren't captured in the consumer frame. And it also, because of that, by leaving out government policy, it leaves out the possibility that, laws could be passed that would change the incentive structure that makes people continue to make the choice to buy meat. So people can't imagine, when they're in the consumer frame, they can't imagine any way that, and I think it's pretty understandable. For me, I am actually kind of sympathetic to their feeling that their actions as individual consumers don't matter that much, or not enough for them to make a big sacrifice. So what we developed through a lot of testing, again, I'll read this paragraph, so don't worry. We basically found that, the consumer frame and the sense of futility are really closely linked, and that the key to addressing people's feeling that it doesn't matter what they do because they can't make a difference, is about shifting our messaging out of this consumer focus. And I should have mentioned earlier, it's true that it's the kind of default way that people have of thinking about food and therefore thinking about animal rights and veganism. But it's also true that we've reinforced that with messaging that focuses on asking people to change their purchasing habits, change what they buy, and not really offering them other ways that they can take action and support it. Of course, we say they could, become animal activists, but that's a pretty high threshold. So it's not only offering them other ways, but offering them kind of a vision of how could this change actually happen. And so what we have here was a paragraph that we developed over many rounds of testing, and that was actually cobbled together largely, and we'll talk more about other messages later, that are kind of cobbled together from comments from the research participants themselves. So one of our goals was to try to develop messages that are using layperson language and just the way that the normal general public talks and thinks about these issues, instead of the way that kind of animal activists like us who are steeped in all this, we get we have, anyway, you get what I'm saying. Okay, so I'm just gonna read the next slide already. So we call this the evolving together message, and one is it focuses, like I said, shifting out of that consumer frame into what we call a civic frame, where it focuses on the potential of collective action through the government, through public policy, but also just through other kind of institutions. And it uses this metaphor of evolution that we found was really important in reminding people like that society does change, it does evolve over time, and actually something that seems, really intractable right now could change, and that's happened before. So we have this message, we're calling for an evolution away from meat at the societal level, where consumers, food producers, restaurants, and grocery stores, that clause is about kind of painting a picture of how could this actually work, right? Like, oh, what are all these institutions that are involved in what food choices are available? And we could name the government in there too. Work together to replace meat from animals and fishes with animal-free foods like beans and vegetables, along with innovative meat alternatives. So really just it's not like this message is, going to perfectly like suddenly turn every meat eater into an animal activist or something, but this is how we can start to paint a picture for the general public of what this transition is going to look like. And let me see what my next slide is. Well, here were some responses to hearing that message. So these were people who, again, everyone that we were interviewing, these were meat eaters, general, otherwise they were from all different walks of life, all in the United States. And they've been saying, these were all people who said, yeah, maybe I have some discomfort with it, varying levels of discomfort, but they had all these justifications, or they had just said the futility thing, and then we would test this message on them, and these are some examples of the kinds of things they would say. Oh, I would think that was a good thing. Like, it would be probably good to get dragged along, like, oh, we're all having so basically no one wants to be the first one to, oh, I have to change my diet and I'm going to be judged and people are going to mock me for being vegetarian. But if we're all in it together, oh, there's an 80% tax on beef. All right, well, I guess I'm not going to eat hamburgers anymore. People are, actually saying they would support that. Yeah, again, I'm happy to share the slides later, so I don't just have to waste everyone's time reading through all these quotes, but exciting stuff. Okay, so when we could address the futility issue, and happy to talk more about this in a Q&A a bit later, and that message and stuff, but so write down your questions or whatever. Addressing futility, that was like one, early on in our research, we kind of figured that was the most pervasive and kind of effective counter argument that people had. So it was like our first big focus was, how do we undermine that and have it be not so easy for people to write us off just based on that. So once we found that didn't solve the problem completely. And so then basically once you get people over the futility thing, they come back to these other justifications. So we're going to talk about some of these. We can also call them rationalizations. So for the next few minutes, I'm hoping that this can be a little bit more interactive. I'm going to open up my chat here so that I can invite everyone to chat things in, and just kind of talk about like how would you currently respond to some of these. So I'll just sort of reiterate and frame this up, and feel free to start typing into the chat, and we can also invite a few folks to just raise your hand on Zoom and share like, how do you respond when you hear this come up when you're doing outreach. But yeah, so as anyone's typing, I'll just kind of frame up again, like that these are maybe things that we hear a lot, and I maybe used to think of them as like deflections, but actually a lot of these rationalizations kind of really are like some of these core held beliefs that are stopping people from the really important things. So for us to start to try to proactively address these things. So yeah, if anyone, you could feel free to raise your hand and on Zoom, and we could have a few people share verbally or also type in the chat. Nisha says culture evolves. Absolutely. The evolution metaphor partly developed around the culture thing. Tradition / comfort, anything can be, yeah, letting people know about the alternatives that you can make their familiar foods with. The example about, I see from Tenebrae, example about like past changes, like past examples of culture changing. Matt Collins. Okay, Matt, you nailed it. Okay, that's what I was looking for. My way back on here. So I think all those ideas are good and good ways to respond to this. And I want to suggest that before you do those things, a really effective tool that I would use, and we could use this for any of these justifications too, that we might not be used to, or like might be edgy and uncomfortable for a lot of us, is actually to empathize with the objection. And even maybe a different word I gave acknowledge here, but validate, like give some affirmation to the values that are underneath where this is coming from. So when we hear a thing about culture, what we're hearing is that people value connection to their grandparents, their family, connection to their childhood. Another version of this culture objection that it was kind of actually surprising how often we heard this wasn't so much about my childhood and my culture, but there are other cultures. I want to respect other people's cultures who have, using animals as like an important part of their culture. So there's like some real values there that I think if we set aside the fact that people are using those values to justify violence against animals, we could say, just the value by itself, we can see some truth to that. Maybe we share it ourselves. I think probably a lot of us do. Some of us might not find that value all that important for ourselves, but I think hopefully we can at least kind of see that it's a reasonable thing to care about. And basically when people hear, I mentioned like, when we don't talk about these things, we maybe seem out of touch. Like when we're able to show people that we actually do care about the same things that they care about, not just like jump to the solution, but yeah, basically give empathy and show that we understand the deep values that are underpinning what they're saying, and that we share those values, and that maybe we have something in common with them. We can build a common bridge, and then they feel heard, and that defensiveness really relaxes. So in a lot of our interviews, we tested these kind of affirmation messages. Someone mentioned universal needs. Definitely, I think a lot of our approach to this was based on like the nonviolent communication framework. We tested these affirmation messages, and people would just kind of melt. Like they'd be like, yeah, that's it. And so they would say, yes, that is what's important for me. And then by themselves, they would then say, and you know what, I can see how I can actually keep my value of family tradition intact without needing to kill animals for it. So they, just by giving that empathy, that was enough that they could then like have the space for themselves to not feel judged and not feel defensive, and kind of reach their own conclusion that actually they don't need to keep killing animals to be in line with those values. So awesome. We're going to do another one. And I'll just say, I mean, that empathy solution is a great solution to any of these justifications. So I strongly encourage that, but especially the culture one. But yeah, we'll look at some other solutions. So another one is naturalness that we've probably all heard of. It might seem kind of similar, but we think that they're a little bit different. So human evolution, talking about ancestors, how hunting is like this part of our evolution and stuff, and the circle of life, and the natural order of things. What are some ways that we could respond to these currently? And again, feel free to raise a hand or just put it in the chat. Tenebrae, I'm not quite sure I understand the "we are made of meat" suggestion, if you want to elaborate on that. Yeah, I'm not sure who's on an iPhone, but modern day animal farming and shopping at the grocery store are super unnatural. Like the antibiotics and I mean, there's so many extremely unnatural things, the conditions. This is actually a very, I think, very strong argument. Like emphasize, like undermine the kind of naturalness thing by demonstrating that modern animal farming is super unnatural. And even like farming and domestication at all, but especially, I think it's pretty easy for people. That's exactly the reaction people have when they see factory farm images, and is like that the conditions and the close quarters and everything is unnatural. And this is big, so that's a great one. Nisha, go to a sanctuary and see if you have an urge to eat the animals. Yeah, that's a nice thing. Yeah, Matt, Ty, other examples of things that maybe are common in nature that we consider immoral. These are all good. And maybe similarly, like just a strategy that can complement any of those lines of reasoning. Let's see what I wrote here. I might say this even a little bit differently than I put it on the slide. Basically, we found with the naturalness one, it's kind of, basically for all the reasons that you all were pointing out, it's so internally inconsistent and flawed that when people hear it reflected back to them in just like the purest form, they just like, yeah, that's really, they would, most of the time they'd be just like, yeah, that's really stupid. Yeah, okay, I don't really agree with that. So we tested we did a lot of testing with this naturalness message, where like we would take a quote from a earlier participant who was using this justification, and then we would just share it back to a later participant in an interview. We'd say, so some people think, and we just share the quote of naturalness. And when we started doing that, it was amazing how much people were just like, oh yeah, no, that's a terrible argument. That doesn't work at all. So when a suggestion, or even potentially even being proactive with this one, because it is really common with the Lions though thing, when we hear this a lot, but especially when we hear it in outreach. Not so the mockery thing here, I wouldn't use this in outreach. That's kind of a strategy for more like if you're like designing messages for a campaign, if you're designing like social media ads or something. I think that this message is really vulnerable to mockery in general, because I think when people kind of hear a pure version of it, they're just like, yeah, that's just so dumb. I don't agree with that. But when someone's just said it, I would not suggest like just saying to their face that that's really dumb. But I think just stating it back really, and this is similar to empathy. And someone was alluding to nonviolent communication earlier. It's just like this kind of strategy of just like reflecting, you can sort of frame it as like, oh, let me just make sure I understood what you just said. So you think that because, our ancestors did this, we ought to continue doing it, or whatever it is, whatever version of it that they just said, just state it kind of in really plain language. And it just kind of usually sounds like so ridiculous that people will be like, okay, yeah, I don't think that's a very good argument. So great. Nisha, I would love to come back to that point later in Q&A about how the speciesist argument beliefs don't address the fundamental moral question. What I basically kind of want to just reiterate saying that right now is like where we are with these justifications is that if we can really get people into that sweet spot of ambivalence and dissonance, that's where we can convince them on the moral question. So, but if they're if when we're in that third category of justifications, it's like it's hard. If we keep kind of doubling down on the moral thing, people will feel like we're not listening to them. And I think that that's an experience that a lot of people have at outreach, is like people get frustrated because they're like, well, you're not, I've certainly had this experience where in hindsight I would realize, I wasn't really engaging with what someone was saying. I just kept coming back to my point, and they didn't feel heard, and they didn't feel like we were having a conversation. And I think that was a missed opportunity. So, okay. We'll look at one more, freedom of choice. This will come up where someone can even say, a version of this that we hear a lot is like, oh, I respect your, choice to be vegetarian or vegan, but you should respect my choice to eat meat. Or even like, well, maybe I agree with you, but like, I don't think we can, tell other people what to do, or we should be like imposing this or forcing this on people. This is, very much related to that consumer frame stuff we were talking about before. So again, everyone can, how do you respond to this when this comes up in your outreach? Josh, yeah, sort of turning it around and focusing on their choice. Nisha, I think that's so there's two different versions going with the choice thing here. And Nisha's is more taking the choice lens and applying it to the animals and saying, what about their choice? And then other folks are, taking it and applying it back to the person and being like, well, so therefore shouldn't you make the choice to be compassionate? I'm gonna caution, not discourage, but caution about the one that's focused on the choice and freedom of the person you're talking to. Because basically, let's go back to this idea of framing. And I probably haven't done a good enough job of defining framing and kind of how it operates. But it's like, at any point, we can sort of be looking through an issue through one frame. And these frames, again, being these like patterns of beliefs and patterns of language and words that we use to make sense of the world, make sense of an issue. And when we look, frames have this kind of mutual inhibitive quality. So like, that was some jargon, but like, think of like your bicep and your tricep. Like when you flex one, it kind of deactivates the other. Frames are kind of the same way. And so when we're in one frame, and what we've found, and other researchers found this too, is that like that sort of personal choice consumer frame is where a lot of opposition to our goals comes from. And we're really trying to get out of that. And I think there's a danger in kind of reaffirming this personal choice angle. So my suggested strategy here would be leaning into like trying to break out of that frame, right? What's the information that's not contained in that frame that is actually going to show people that way that you're kind of thinking about it right now is incomplete? And that, I think, one really effective way we found to do that in our research is information about subsidies. So like, and this is a tricky one because subsidies are like really complicated and economic stuff, and people, it's like can get over people's heads really quickly. But it is, if we can figure out a sort of effective, concise way to talk about subsidies, and I think it's possible. We found some good reason to think that it's possible. This is a really compelling piece of information that breaks that whole consumer frame down. And it's like, well, sure, you want to say people should have the choice, but that's not what's happening right now. What's happening right now is actually the government is taking your taxpayer dollars and directing them in a huge proportions towards this industrial animal cruelty, and I don't have a choice to pull my money out of that. So really, this is a bigger problem than just to some extent. And again, I think it's actually, we need to start acknowledging that this is a bigger problem than just the choices of the person in front of us is making. Okay, let me peek at the chat again. So this was, as I mentioned a little earlier, I'll speak at the clock. Oh, we're doing great on time. Okay, great. Okay, how's everyone feeling? Good. All right, sweet. So we're gonna roll on ahead, and look at some other slides, and then we'll have a more open Q&A after that. So if you have any burning questions that weren't about this, I'll ask you to hold on to them a little longer, and then we can get into it at the end. And I'm probably gonna skip over some sections of slides, so anyway, you're not missing anything too important, but also there's more, some of the stuff that I'll skip over partly is just because if you're interested, you can dig into that further on our website. And actually, while I'm at it, I'm just going to stick a URL in the chat right now where you can see we have like an interactive website about a lot of these findings. So I'm going to try to focus more on the things that maybe are not as easy to learn just from those reports and stuff. And then we'll have a Q&A or a discussion. Okay, so onwards. Basically going to pivot now. At this point, pretty much up until now, I've been focusing on the findings that we were able to get from just the one-on-one interviews, and I'm going to pivot now to the focus groups. Won't talk too much about the methodology, so we'll just keep moving. But not only did we shift from one-on-one kind of interviews to groups where we were trying to get people to engage with each other more. And the reasoning for that was we wanted to see, what arguments would actually stick in a group. And that's people kind of process ideas and make sense of their beliefs and decide what their opinions are as groups, because we're social beings. So this was kind of a chance to more play this out. And we also switched to kind of testing with these messages. So whereas up until this point in the study, we'd just been kind of trying to draw people out on what they already thought. It gradually changed, but at this point, we really started formally, okay, we're putting a message in front of them and seeing how that lands. And this is an example of, this slide is just an example of what people were seeing. So these were these kind of fake made to look like a social media ad about a fictional ballot measure. We would tell them, and then after the study was over, we would tell them it was a fiction, but we would tell them that there was an animal rights ballot measure in Colorado or in Oregon, and these were arguments for it. So that's just an example, just so that you know what we're gonna see some of these, and that's just what it was, is these kind of fake social media ads. And we're gonna look at some of the components that we're testing in these messages. We're obviously the content of the message, but also the tone, and that's the first thing we'll talk about. And then messengers, and we're probably going to skip over messengers because that's not super, can't control who you are when you're doing street outreach. You're just who you are, but maybe you can play up certain aspects of yourself. But anyway, so maybe we'll talk about that a little bit. We're going to talk about tone though, because this I think can really be very useful to doing just street level outreach, kind of understanding how people perceive animal advocates. And it can also be useful for if you're designing sort of messaging. So I'll just say that, yeah, there's the two components we're going to look at. We're going to talk about like the sort of factual, more like what we could call cool or like sterile side of tone, and then the emotional side and how to make those fit together. But also each of them on their own have interesting challenges. So talk about facts first. I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but what we found with facts is that people are like at first, one of the most common objections we heard when we were testing some of these messages, like the images that I showed a second ago, people said, I want more facts. Like, I don't just want these, emotional appeals. Like, show me the facts, show me the numbers. That's what's going to convince me. But then when we actually did that, they would say, well, who did that study? Like, what were their motives? Who funded them? Like, I don't really believe this. So that was really interesting. I was like, oh, shucks, they're saying that they want to make a fact-based argument, but then, they have a lot of skepticism about different, and that's pretty understandable. Probably a lot of us, can relate to that. Like, it's pretty hard to navigate this current, this landscape of like, how do we know who to trust? And then, so we would try providing a citation, and we say, okay, you don't want to, you're curious, you want to dig into this, like, yeah, just basically, we'll get into as much as it was difficult, and there was kind of contradictions in how people wanted to relate to facts and messaging. We do have some suggestions. So facts can definitely make messages stronger and can make outreach stronger. And so having your facts ready, that's good. Numerical facts, like, the thing is, let me say this about facts. It's not really the case that these members of the general public, these sort of lay people who are non-experts on this issue, and they're not experts on all the issues that are interrelated to animal farming, right? So they're not hearing these numbers. This is maybe going to sound a little cynical. They're not hearing these numbers and like making a sort of rigorous scientific conclusion about whether that number means, this is a big enough issue for them to be concerned about. It's just like the presence of numbers and facts just makes it more authoritative. And it just like, they want factiness. Like, they want the sense that there's facts behind our argument and we've done the research and they can trust us. So including facts, largely I would say, is about increasing the kind of authority of the messenger. And in this case, you. And numerical facts do that much more effectively, right? They have that facty quality to them if you can throw out some numbers. So having numbers, that's great. Include numbers. Specifically, well, okay. It's the best numbers are when you can compare the impact of not just stating, oh, animal-based meat it's responsible for whatever percentage of carbon emissions, but being ready to be able to compare. So like, what's the solution? So we talked earlier about people having difficulty like imagining the change, right? So if we're trying to paint a picture for people of how this is actually going to change, the best facts you could have on hand are ones that are, comparing the current situation with animal farming to what we could replace it with and how that would actually change it. So say, if we eliminate animal farming and replace it with plant farming, we can eliminate this percentage of greenhouse gas emissions. Providing a citation. So I mentioned like people are skeptical of factual claims. They want to know where the studies are. They want to know who funded them. And when we figured out that we could start, and I don't think I have an example of what one of the images looked like, but when we figured out that we could just start putting a link on the image that was, read more, here's the studies, like click on this link. And people, this was a set, this was like a slide. It was actually just like this. We conducted these on Zoom, and we would be sharing the slides. So they couldn't even click on the link, but the link just being there made them so much more confident and comfortable that, okay, there's actually, and, of course we were using real studies and we were using fake links, but we could, with the fiction that being that we could create a website where we would list these studies, and then someone could hypothetically go and read all those studies and scrutinize them carefully. Is how many people are going to do that? Probably very, very few, but they're comforted by the idea that they can do it. And obviously, we shouldn't just bullshit. We should use the real, make it be true that they could go and look and see this data for themselves. So, and when you're doing outreach, that's like, just have, if you're going to have numbers, have the citations ready, know who did the studies, maybe make a, have a notebook or whatever where you're ready to, back up your claims. So that's going to really improve your credibility and your sense of authority. And the last thing that's very much also related to that sense of authority is just not exaggerating. So I'll just reiterate, like, people aren't evaluating these factual claims that we're making through an expert lens where they know, oh, it would really have to be 40% emissions, for me to be convinced and go vegan. Like 17%, they'll hear that and oh, that's big. Especially if you make it sound, if you say, because it is big. So, if animal agriculture is responsible for 17% of emissions, that's really big. And it's a huge problem. So basically err on the side of the more modest side of the range. Definitely don't exceed, don't exaggerate our numbers, because the lower numbers work just as well. And the exaggerated numbers give people, like what I said here, they give people the excuse that they're looking for to just dismiss everything you said. And if they kind of catch you in something that they're going to, even if you feel that your number was accurate, if they catch you in something that they think, you're kind of distorting, they're just going to write off everything you said. So just trusting that, like, even the more kind of modest range of the number spectrum, when there's a range of numbers that might be the truth, is going to be persuasive. Okay. Just check the chat. Talk a little bit about emotions, and we're going to cruise on here. Okay. All right. This is probably the last thing we talk about, which is great. We'll look at one thing quickly after this. So the other side of facts is emotions, right? So when all those people were saying, yeah, just show me the facts, don't just use these emotion things. What they were saying was basically like, the more severe version of that, which we heard from a lot of participants, was that they see these emotional appeals as basically emotionally manipulative. And in fact, a lot of them came in to these interviews with a pre-existing notion that animal advocates are often emotionally manipulative. And they don't like that. They really don't like that, and they find it dishonest. I certainly don't agree with that assessment, but that's what people are thinking. But there's a flip side to that, which is that, people think of themselves as like very rational beings who only make their decisions on facts, but we all know that that's not true at all. And it actually is totally necessary to, like, to make an emotional connection to the issue is totally necessary. If we don't make an emotional connection to the issue, they're just not even going to care. They're going to like, well, why? They're not going to pay attention to the facts, and the facts are going to be, not mean anything. So we need to be able to make an emotional connection and draw out the emotional relevance of the issue without being seen as manipulative. So how do we do that? Well, fortunately, we do have a couple suggestions, and you can use these in outreach. So the first thing I would say is just tone it down. Trust that the substance of what we're talking about, violence against animals in modern farming and in other industries, is so graphic and so horrific, and emotional by itself, that we don't really need to use like elevated emotional language to do so. If we just describe what actually happens, right, it's emotional. And if we use, basically we don't need to use a lot of adverbs and like just flowery language. Just trust that we don't need to use those things because it's emotional enough by itself, and in fact they kind of make us seem less credible. So toning it down. And then part of this related to that is like using a lot of questions. I think I have an example of this on the next slide. I do. Great. So this is an example of a message that we tested, and it's actually a fairly emotionally charged message. But the key to this is the last read it. Whatever the industry might claim, I don't think anybody with a heart in their chest can watch the videos from slaughterhouses and not feel disgusted. Animals deserve freedom from slaughter. And then this last part, we focus on our freedom, but what about theirs? The original version of this message, the last sentence was different. It said something like, we have no right to keep doing this to them when we could switch to an animal-based food system, or sorry, a plant-based food system. And people, didn't like that message. They thought it was a little too intense and judgmental. And when we just changed the last part to a question, which is an obviously leading question, that had a pretty significant effect on how people received it. So, and I think you can do that, and you can also do more genuine questions, like using questions. What I said on the last slide, it's like leaving room for the listener to make their own connections. So if we lay out the dots and then help people make the connection themselves, like they feel more engaged. It's just such a more effective way to engage with people. Like they feel more engaged. They feel like they're coming to their own conclusions. The opinion is their own. It's much more likely to stick. So really encourage a lot of questions, and not just like that Socratic kind of outreach method. Probably a lot of people that probably a lot of you use that and might look to sort of role models of outreach. I certainly think of people who really use that like Socratic method. So encourage that. Another one to whatever. Yeah, I mean this actually also very applicable to outreach. And the next slide has a little bit of graphic stuff on it. Is to let the pictures do the talking. So again, if I was saying a second ago, it's just like the substance of describing what's happening in these industries is emotional enough. Pictures in the same way, can make an emotional connection without being, without it seeming like you're being manipulative, because you're just showing a picture, right, of something that's actually happening. Now, that said, even that can be seen as manipulative. And one thing that we really commonly heard is that people felt that animal activists showing slaughter footage, they saw that as emotionally manipulative. And I'm not trying to say that this means we should never show slaughter footage, but I would say just be aware that it might damage our kind of credibility. So there's like, people need to see that stuff. I absolutely think that, but is there maybe a way that we can get them to see that stuff without them attributing it to like a person who's in front of them? Or maybe when we're having an outreach conversation, that's not the right time to like shock someone with the slaughter footage. But instead, there are other images that we might be able to use that might be even more effective at creating an emotional connection without and eliciting disgust without creating that defensiveness. So two examples. It's a little bit gory. It's not slaughter footage, but one is just pictures of like happy, thriving animals was really effective at creating an. So like when people see this cute baby cow, and they would all be like, oh, and they'd be like, oh, I don't want this cute baby cow to turn into a hamburger, even though they're not having to see that happening in the picture. Like they know what we're talking about. And then on the right, so it's like basically sticking to either side. So yeah, well, let me just say it. On the right is images of animals' bodies after slaughter. And it's not quite as shocking as like footage of the act of slaughter. That's so overwhelming for people that it seems emotionally manipulative. This is a little more like, there's a few things that this is doing. One is it's filling in the missing stages between animals and meat, which people have a really strong disconnect between. So pictures of animals' bodies where they're still they're like, you can see both the animal here, but you can also see what they're, like meat, both the meat and the animal are recognizable in this image. And we found that this was really effective in eliciting disgust without eliciting that kind of defensiveness or sense that people are being manipulated. And so sort of one thing that we're going to be exploring is making use of those kinds of images more in advocacy. Okay, one more of these, and which is just a kind of, so again, if people are seeing emotional appeals as manipulative, the last way around that we recommend is to just directly challenge that. So not using like super elevated emotional language and flowery language and lots of adverbs, but just just directly call out the idea that there's anything wrong with emotions, and actually that emotions are important information. So here's a message we tested. James Cromwell has not ever said this as far as I know. We were just testing lots of different messengers. We're going to skip the section on messengers, but you can look at our different reasoning for using different messengers on our website if you want. But anyway, we attributed this quote to him, and anyone could say this, something like, if you have an emotional reaction to seeing footage of animals suffering inside slaughterhouses, that's a good sign that you're a human being. Emotions are good. Feeling anguish about what these animals go through is useful information. We should listen to that. Be on the right side of history. So, and this was a really effective message. People who might otherwise have said, or even did otherwise say, those emotional messages, they're manipulative. When you just directly challenge that idea, most people would be like, oh, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it is an emotional thing. And people, they basically goes back to that framing thing, right? Where people have all those different frames in their head that are all contradictory. And they have this one frame that's like, oh, you're trying to emotionally manipulate me. They have this other frame that's like, where they've heard things about emotions are good and we should be reclaiming our emotions. And that's part of being human. So very effective. All right. Just going to look, we're going to skip over some stuff here, and let's see where I can go. One more. Yeah, I'm just going to look at two, kind of tying a lot of everything that we've already talked about together. Going to look at two kind of really strong performing messages that came out of our research. And I'm just going to skim over these, and then we're going to get to then I'm going to kind of summarize everything that we've talked about, and then we'll do a Q&A. So how are we doing on time? All right, we'll try to get this done in just a couple minutes. Really going to skim here because you can read more about this on our website. One of these messages that we really suggest is, like, we talked about the shift from the consumer frame to a civic frame, or like from just thinking about their actions as a consumer to their actions as a voter. And we really suggest kind of using stories of this. So you could even talk about this for yourself. We often pair this with like a meat eater a messenger who explicitly states that they still eat meat. And we found that to be really effective. You can read more about that, what the kind of reasoning behind that is. But also any one of us could say this, that, because this is probably true for a lot of us. Like there was a time where I, was aware of what was happening in slaughterhouses, and I thought it was wrong and horrible, but I hadn't yet, changed my diet to reflect that. And part of the reason for that was that I just couldn't imagine, that it was just like, it's just a reality. I was like, it's this thing that happens and it's sad, but it's not ever going to change. So what does it matter? But then something changed my perspective. So that shift, telling that story of what happened to you that changed your perspective, where you could actually see, oh, I do actually think change is possible now. And specifically, I think change is possible because I don't just think of myself. I realize that I'm not just a consumer. I'm also a citizen of this society, and like we have the power to act together to make this change. So it can actually change. So it's a good angle, and so we could spend a whole hour just talking about this one. So and then the second one that I'll just shout out is, and again, probably a lot of you already use this in your outreach, really targeting the humane myth. So this humane deception, sense of humane is like one thing that a lot of people lean on to justify their own animal product consumption. And the key with this narrative is basically asserting through the story that everyone knows that those labels don't mean anything. and asserting that it's actually common knowledge, that that's just a big, like, industry manipulation, and it's just clever marketing, but it's not true. So these words, it's no secret, at the beginning is kind of this message that we really suggest using a lot of. So it's no secret that, what cage free, what you doesn't really mean what the industry wants you to think it means. And people, no one wants to be the one person who like doesn't know what everyone else knows, right? And no one wants to be the one idiot who's falling for that clever marketing campaign. So that's kind of what this message is about, like suggesting that if they're falling for it, it's just them. Everyone else already knows that that's bullshit. So cool. Yeah, that's all I'm going to say about that one. All right. So I'm just going to zoom through a little review of everything that we talked about. So when we're doing outreach to the public, the number one, at least what our research found, certainly one of the most pervasive things that people use to dismiss our message is futility, the sense that it's never going to change, doesn't matter what I do. And that is closely linked to the consumer frame, their natural way of thinking about the issue, that, the only way they have any influence is on what they buy, and they only think about themselves at the grocery store. And I mean, it's totally overwhelming. You're like, I'm at the grocery store, there's all this meat, doesn't matter what I do. So, and on top of that, our messages often reinforce that. We, by focusing on that, only on diet change, and without providing a vision of how else this could all change. Or what other thing, it might take consumer change and other things, and we don't focus on those other things enough. So the key to overcoming futility is shifting from a consumer frame to what I'm calling a civic frame, where the role of politics and like the fact that we could act on animal suffering through changing laws and through voting for politicians. We can talk in Q&A if anyone's interested about, how Pax Fauna is trying to kind of develop this as an avenue. Things to try to include in messengers. Sorry, we didn't talk about messengers, but yeah, well, you can read more on that. Making an emotional connection, but doing so in a careful way, a restrained way. Then including some facts, non-exaggerated numerical facts being the strongest ones, especially if they compare current situation to what would be possible if we evolved away from farming animals. Cite your sources. Provide people the means to look into it themselves. Use this evolving language, super effective social evolution, talking about society evolving together. And then all the strategies that we talked about to preempt common objections, these ones right here. For giving empathy, especially for the culture one, but also for any objection, just checking in first with like the values underpinning it, and like show that you share those values. Maybe tell a story about your family tradition too that you wouldn't want to give up, or a family tradition that you didn't want to give up, and then you found a solution with with an animal for your food, but starting by really connecting to those values. Or sometimes just reflecting the argument right back at them, force them to look at it, see how irrational it is. A lot of people will be willing to do that, especially if you've already empathized with them. Cool. I think that's pretty much close to the end here. All right, yeah, and basically we'll go into Q&A here, but if you're interested in what Pax Fauna is doing, we got a lot of other exciting projects coming up. You can sign up to our mailing list at paxfauna.org. I'll drop a link in the chat, but we don't send out very many emails, but lots of exciting research and stuff. And we're always looking for volunteers, and we are starting to work on a pilot campaign in Denver, Colorado. So if there's anyone on this call who's in Colorado who I don't already know, we should meet. And if you know anyone in Colorado, you should get them plugged in to what we're doing. So that's it. I will probably stop sharing my screen and I'll pass it over to Michelle.
That was so great, Aidan. That was just so thorough. I loved it. And, incredibly helpful and incredibly practical and grounded, and kudos on your research. So I'm going to go to a question. We're opening it up for questions now. You're welcome to place your questions in the chat, or you can hit the hand raise icon. So there is from Tenebrae in the chat, Aidan, how do we get people to bear witness?
Yeah, it's a good question. Can I just confirm, Tenebrae, do you mean like slaughterhouse vigils in particular, or maybe elaborate on what you mean by that?
Yes, there are people I know who care a great deal who refuse to look. They simply won't look. It hurts too much to look as they keep eating meat.
Yeah. So I'll admit that what this touches on is, I think, one of the biggest unresolved questions for us coming out of this research, which is that, so we really would like to encourage a shift in animal advocacy, but I've just said this probably 20 times over the last 90 minutes, but I'm going to say it one more time. A shift away from this, like, focus only on consumer advocacy and only on thinking of the, certainly on engaging with the public only in the consumer space, to engaging with them in what I call the civic sphere, like other ways of being active as like members of a neighborhood or a society, or, and one really effective way to, effective is the wrong word. The main probably activity that lots of people engage in the civic sphere, the best example of civic activity is voting. And we would love to give people more chances to vote around the animal rights movement, but people only vote, one day a year, and there's 364 other days a year. And the question, how I'm kind of where I'm going with this question, Tenebrae, is like, it's a challenge to figure out how can we actually give people ways to be active supporters of the animal movement in the civic sphere. Because in the consumer sphere, it's kind of easy, like, to figure out what are some small steps that people can take. Well, maybe someone's not ready to go vegan. They can, reduce or whatever. They can do meatless Mondays. And we're trying to figure out what are things, what's the equivalent of that that's getting out of the consumer frame? What are small actions that people can take in support of the animal movement? And I basically, my concern is that, like, getting involved in activism is just a huge ask for most people. It's just way too much to imagine doing that. And like, most people just are not politically active on any issue for anything even. And there might be other things that they care about more than animals that they're not active for either. So how, I think it's like probably too much to hope that, oh, let's shift from asking people to go vegan to like asking them to come protest at the Capitol building or come, attend a city council meeting about something related to our campaign to shut down slaughterhouses. It's just, so basically, yeah, unfortunately, my sort of non-answer of your question is like, I'm not sure, we need steps that people can take on the way to going to a slaughterhouse vigil. Like, that's probably too big of an ask for most people. And I don't have an answer to that yet. Other than, I think voting is an answer. I think, voting in favor of a animal rights policy is something a lot of people are willing to do, and actually told us that they would do, and they would jump at the chance to do. And that's something that we're trying to create, the conditions for. But that's, again, that leaves 364 other days a year. So I don't know.
Okay, thank you, Tenebrae. I hope that answers your question. And I'm going to go to a question on Nisha and Jeremy's question in the chat, and I'm going to go to Tim, who has his hand up. So do you know what your sample size was?
Yeah, so we interviewed about 80 people in the one-on-one setting, and then about 100 people in focus groups. So we interviewed just under 200 people, and wound up with just over 100 hours of interviews. Those exact numbers are on our website. I will say, basically, this was a qualitative research. So it's not the kind of thing where we're trying to make any sort of quantitative claims about, X percentage of people think this thing. So sample sizes, we use different standards in qualitative research around data quality than in quantitative research. In qualitative research, the standard, I'm going to nerd out on this, is data saturation. So it's like when you're doing interviews and you stopped hearing any new things, that's when you consider like that you've reached what's called data saturation in qualitative research.
Very nice. Great. Okay, good. So Tim, you have your hand raised. You want to go ahead and unmute and ask your question for Aidan?
Yes, I would love to. Thank you for the talk and for the amazing research that you're doing. So I kind of have a question, but also maybe a suggestion for further research. I actually just gave a talk at an old rich folks country club, introducing them about veganism. So yeah, there was a tough crowd, yeah, I just recognized a lot of the findings. I mean, I'm also an organizer with AV Street Outreach, but I hold many kinds of lectures on veganism for different types of crowds. And yeah, it's definitely true. Like for me, the formula I tell to new outreach is always connection, correction, motivation. That usually works a lot. Like make a connection with a person, then do the correcting part, and then give them some motivation. And yeah, another thing that I was just wondering if you also looked at it in your research, because I guess everybody here doing any kind of animal rights activism has come to the realization how flawed and irrational human beings are, and that just gets confirmed more and more. So when I started my activism, I actually looked quite like a rebel. So I had the dreadlocks, I had like the alternative look. Nowadays, I wear in a suit. I'm dressed up pretty, standard. And as much as I hate to admit it, it seems to work awfully well. So even today, despite my arguments getting compliments after the talk, most people said we didn't expect vegans wearing nice suits. So apparently it's also not only content that we can learn a lot from, but also stupid things as the ways we dress our hair. And for me, I never like to go to the gym. I hate the gym. But ever since I get bigger and more muscular, then I don't want to promote any kind of ableism here. But unfortunately, it does really help a lot. Most of the times when I'm doing vegan street outreach and I start with protein deficiency, and I'm looking at them like, are you serious? Because they're nowhere near my size. So I was just wondering in the research, because the format seems to be, I don't know what's more important, but it seems to be very important for people about what kind of images that the form and who says it, and the way it's being said seems to be outweighing what is being said. And then another thing that I think I would just like to share with you, maybe for future research or for other people here, because we've all encountered how hard it is to get people into doing activism, right? It's very, very hard. It seems such a big burden. But I've also noticed something with again, for activists, it's very hard, because you're talking about moving away from the consumer frame to the civic frame. Now, besides my street activism, I'm also very active in politics. Now, you probably think I'm active in the Netherlands. We even have a party for the animals, very, very progressive, very cool. But this party, even though I'm very happy with this party, they will be in the opposition forever. So they're never gonna make changes. They're never gonna make laws. So what I do with some other vegan infiltrators and spies, we actually joined the right conservative fuckers, and that's where all the animal lobbyists are. And we are trying to get, like you're saying, to get that civic transition going. We need more vegans getting active and speaking out on behalf of animals for the streets, but also vegan and animal rights activists. They don't want to go to those trenches either, because most of the time when I tell people what we're doing in politics, they're saying like, yo, you're busy with the enemy. You're helping the wrong people. No, we're not helping the wrong people, because this is where all the animal farmers and all the animal lobbyists are at. And when we are in those spaces, And we come with this innovation story, and that, you know, this animal farming is capital intensive, it's high risk, we shouldn't invest in that anymore. Then those lobbyists get afraid. So I would actually also, maybe that's something future research. But again, it's same like how we are frustrated that vegans don't want to go on the street. I'm also getting a little bit frustrated with people that are animal rights activists, don't understand that converting people to veganism is very noble, and I still love doing it, and I will still be doing it. But indeed, the civic societal change, we need to also infiltrate more and more in mainstream politics, even though it's a very, very, very ugly world. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah.
I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And thanks for joining from Amsterdam. Sorry, Michelle, you want to?
Yeah, it's a bit late, but it's worth it.
Your passion comes through. Go ahead, Aidan, sorry.
Yeah, great questions. I'll kind of answer them in reverse and try to keep it concise. For the, you know, the challenge of convincing our own, you know, I mean, I think, let me just say, it's not an easy thing at all for the animal movement to pivot from being more focused on consumerism to being more focused in the civic realm. It's an issue that goes far beyond messaging. Like, it isn't simply a matter of how we talk about it. It's a big strategic question, which kind of alludes to what I was saying before in response to Tenebrae about, like, how do we provide the public with actions that they can take in the civic realm? That's a huge strategic question. Briefly, since I've alluded to it, in the United States, we have this great, exciting, pretty unique tool of citizen-initiated ballot measures, which a lot of people outside the US have never even heard of. Most countries don't have that. And I think a lot of people in the US don't realize how rare and special it is, which is where, you know, basically any group of people can get together and start collecting signatures, and they collect enough signatures, they can actually cause a law to be voted on at an election. And so that's a way that we can actually put animal rights laws directly in front of the public. But that's just, that alone is not sufficient to make this shift happen into the civic realm and make our movement a political movement. So that's a big, yeah, absolutely a big question that you know, goes beyond the scope of this research, and that I hope that this research is one part of a number of things that are kind of starting that conversation. As to the messenger stuff, you know, I skipped over some slides about messenger, but we do have a lot of findings about that. What I'll just briefly say, and I think this is something that anyone can apply if you're doing outreach. In a lot of times that we think about messaging and messengers, like a lot of the research literature on political messengers focuses on authority, like authoritativeness. So using, you know, civic society leaders to deliver messages, like have, you know, really, yeah, like a former elected officials and things like that. What we found is that for our issue, the biggest problem, like, people perceive vegans as this like weird select group that they aren't a part of, and that vegans are just different from the rest of society. So the key, rather than authoritativeness, the key things for animal advocates to kind of convey in our presentation of ourselves is the two: relatability and trustworthiness. So relatability, like, we want to emphasize the ways that we are like the people that we're talking to. And so in the story you shared of the country club, you know, cleaning up, getting a suit on, all those things, you know, that's perfect. In a different setting, it might be different. It's about, like, making, you know, yeah, emphasizing our similarness to the people that we're messaging to. And there's actually some great research on different kinds of change initiatives and how they need different kinds of messengers. And there are some, but anyway, I'll just say our similarness, our relatability to the people we're messaging to, and then trustworthiness, just going back to what we said earlier about people finding it really hard to, like, navigate this sort of landscape of facts. So anyway, there's more about that on our website. Yeah, what else? Michelle?
No, I'm happy with that. No, thanks.
I was muted.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you both so much. We still have a little bit of time for maybe another question or two, but there is a question in the chat from Nitin, who had to drop off, but we can answer the question. How has Pax Fauna addressed the confounding factor of sourcing study participants from Reddit? I am not familiar with this.
Yeah, so I see what
I'm
Nathan's
glad
getting
you're
at is,
familiar. Yeah.
yeah, that there might be, well, just basically when you're finding people to participate in a study, you're always worried about like how might the people that I'm selecting from be skewed in some way that's going to cause me to get a result that's different than I would get if I was really talking to a sort of representative sample of the population. The short answer for Nathan or for anyone else is this might be, I'll just acknowledge right away that this might be a weakness of our research. Nathan knows that we source our participants using like paid focus group forums on Reddit. The aspect in qualitative research, that makes this a little bit less of an issue than in quantitative research, like I said, is it's not a large enough sample anyway that we're not trying to make, quantitative claims about X% of people think this. Instead, we sort of navigated on like, when have we stopped hearing anything new? And so you'd have to think that, the population of Reddit is like categorically totally, not just, in a matter of degree, the number of people on Reddit who hold a certain view, but like actually people on Reddit all hold one view that is otherwise not common among the population, which is probably true of things about like they know how to use Reddit differently or whatever, but it's probably not true about like things that are more, general, like things that it's not related to. So, and then I could say more about just basically our actual population was quite diverse in terms of age and ethnicity, income, lots of other things. So we had good reason to think that, we weren't getting a sort of skewed look by sampling from Reddit, but it's, and I could try to answer that question more in depth, but since Nathan's not here, I won't.
You can follow up, but great. And Tenebrae, you had another question, and that may be our last question, then we'll wrap up, but do you want me to just go ahead and read that? Regarding Meatless Mondays, incrementalism question, how do we move from welfarism to abolitionism? Example, many of us, if it's humane, it's okay as a defense, but no one wants to be humanely slaughtered. So what do you say to folks when that typical comes up?
Yeah, really good question. Okay. Trying to decide how to respond to this one. I recently published a little blog about welfarism and abolitionism and sort of emphasizing like the different strategic needs that these approaches fill in the animal rights movement. And so I want to be careful to sort of make it clear that like, I think that there's a role for welfarist campaigns. It's not public persuasion. So I think welfarism, I agree with what I think Tenebrae is actually getting at here, I very much agree with, which is that welfarism is not an effective avenue for trying to message to the public. And it also leads them to a conclusion that we don't like. Welfarism might be an effective way for the movement to kind of increase our position within the system and increase our leverage within the systems, like to get ourselves positioned and to build up. So there's all those reasons. But in terms of when we're, messaging to, oh yeah, thanks, Josh. Thanks for sharing this. That is indeed what I was referring to. In terms of messaging, we absolutely want to undercut the humane deception. So the one thing that I alluded to that in the slides that I'll restate is like really targeting like the idea that it ever actually happens that way. So people might think, you sort of might say, okay, maybe you think, that it would be okay if it was humane, but let's be real, it never happens that way. And everyone knows that, it's no secret. So I'll actually let me just share my screen again. And look at this slide again. Oh, where is it? Okay. A couple other points that I'll emphasize from this, just as effective ways to kind of, but yeah, every sentence, I'll just say every sentence in this message was carefully calibrated based on lots of feedback from participants, and there's several different angles in here. One is just like just this, so we talked about numerical facts. Here's one, 99% of animals are raised on factory farms, according to the USDA, a totally authoritative source, right? That, is obviously not some kind of vegan propaganda or something. And the picturesque family farm is mostly just a fairy tale used for deceptive marketing. That's kind of appealing to like people are distrustful of corporations, and they know that deceptive marketing exists. And if you say, oh, it's no secret that whole family farm stuff that's just it's just a marketing play. That's not actually what happens. So I think probably that in terms of from the research, what I can feel more confident about as a strategy to get at what Tenebrae is saying, which is try to undermine this like welfare argument, is just to go at like, come on, let's be real, that's not what ever happens, and it couldn't ever happen. So we have this last sentence: there's not enough land on the planet, to do animal agriculture the way that you're talking about. And you can have some facts ready for that too. The other thing I would have to say is just those pictures of thriving animals. I think that's actually another argument in favor of pictures of happy animals instead of pictures of slaughter footage, is the pictures of like gory, factory farm conditions. And again, I think there's a place for those. People need to see those things. But maybe with gory factory farm conditions, they can say, well, that's wrong. Like, it shouldn't be like that. It should be, humane. But when they see the cute cow and he's out in the field and it's not like, graphic conditions, but they just look at him and they say, I don't want him to be killed for meat. That's not what I want. That was what the reaction we tended to observe, is that when people saw the cute baby cow, and he's like, sure is one cute baby cow, they're like, yeah, I see that cow. And, we had one other, actually, yeah, let me share one other slide. Do I have this? Yeah, I do have this. We talk about using animals as messengers, and this was based on this, we heard this version, we heard a few versions of this like comment that I have here on the left. If an animal could walk up to me and say, hey, don't eat me, then I wouldn't eat you. It's like, it's a very weird sentiment, but it's actually something we heard from several people. That's why we experimented with that, just like pictures of animals saying, not, oh, we don't want to be, confined in cages, we want to be humanely slaughtered, but just actually, or ask people. I think, yeah, someone who, has already taken some of this research and applied it to some outreach in a really great video. I'm blanking on her name. She used to be the juggling vegan. I'm sure someone in here will know her name and put it in the chat, but she did a really cool video on this stuff. And, just had examples of her doing outreach, like, asking people like, what do you think animals would say if you could ask them, and everyone's like, oh, well, they'd probably say, please don't eat me. They'd, it's people know. Yeah. So anyway, those are the two strategies I try to put. That's even better. We never did that. I think that was a really brilliant innovation on her part. Was yeah, Natalie Fulton, thank you. It was that move. Okay.
Yeah, people came right up with that name, right up with the answer. Okay, so the last question will be Jeremy. Go ahead and unmute yourself, ask your question now.
Sure, yeah, thanks for such a great thought-provoking session. Both your hosting and Aidan for putting all this together. Always great for animal advocates to connect in these spaces, I think, and share ideas, because, yeah, for obvious reasons. But I guess real quickly, I want to just add something to the footage thing, because that's something I've focused around a lot. I think there's a third option. I think we can show the quote negative side alongside the quote positive side without a focus on conditions. I've developed footage to try to do that and try to find footage that's done in the best way possible. And that's still, so I guess that's just another kind of point alongside that. But I guess my question is, I'm quite passionate about language, anti-speciesist language, and there's been a few references to that tonight. And I guess given our current language is written by speciesists, if there's any language that you choose to focus on using more of, or any language you try to avoid to try to dismantle speciesism, the most obvious example is probably not calling our fellow animals it. But, another example is, even the common language, that I think we've all used at times is, animal farming and stuff. Like, if this was done to humans, we wouldn't refer to it as farming. We'd use far more descriptive language, and not necessarily shocking language, but just kind of curious how you personally, or what your experience has been on how you've evolved your language.
Well, first, let me double click the first thing you said, which around like footage of best practice, of like of the best possible way. I mean, I've, once was capturing some footage of like this like backyard, slaughter operation. It's like, that's the kind of thing, that people think is like, yeah. So I just totally agree with that. I mean, I think that's a very effective way to attack the humane myth, is just actually, have people look at it and be like, no, this is, really, this is what you're saying you want. And also just to reiterate that, I'm not trying to say, I want to make it clear that the point about slaughter footage is narrow. It's that it's sort of around how people respond to it from a messenger standpoint. So like that, I gotta say this again. It's like, if we want people to sort of trust us and be listening to us and not have this reaction that like, oh, you're being emotionally manipulative. So it's like, I absolutely think people need to see those things, and it's just being intentional about how do we get them to see it. And then maybe there's a different setting where we're trying to have, conversation. Another way is just ask, try to set up our outreach so that we're like getting consent to show them footage rather than like having them see. And again, I'm not trying to say that's what we should do 100% of the time. I'm just trying to say it's what we should do when we think we're in a situation where their ability to trust us and rely on it, our credibility with that particular person is at stake. That may be a moment that we would want to be careful about slaughter footage. And so I'm not trying to make a super broad claim. As for specific language, I probably don't have time to say on this. You probably have, I mean, all the basic stuff. Pronouns, obviously. I think the animal farming point is good. What that brought up, which I've actually, another mistake or reason I'm trying to not use animal farming as much as farming of animals, or is just an example, trying to shift towards like away from passive language. So like the language around like, oh, this is, like animal farming describes it as just like this thing, that it's just out there happening. And it's like, no, like it's a thing that's being done by people to animals. And like specific people and specific, you can say corporations, but like, yeah, specific corporations, specific corporate executives making the decision to keep doing this thing. This is like avoiding the passive language and like really speaking about it in terms that describe the actors that are responsible for it. It's probably one thing that I would wish I had even done more of in the last 90 minutes. But other than that, I unfortunately don't have a ton based on this research.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. That was a great question.
Yeah, that was a great question. And Nancy had some great words and terms. Instead of animal agriculture, how about animal agri-torture or animal agri-slaughter, right? I mean, words really impact. Words are really powerful. So we're going to start to wrap up now.
Maybe if I actually just one more thought on that particular thing. Is that
Yeah,
okay,
go
Michelle?
ahead and
Yeah, just that
take it.
slaughter
Your
stuff.
last final thoughts, final
When
words.
we were designing the study, as I said, in our first stage, we were just trying to draw people out on what they already thought rather than testing messages at them. And so we were trying to find the most neutral language possible, so that our goal was that people wouldn't even at first in the interviews know that think that we were animal advocates. And so we shopped it around to a few different researchers and different people who thought about this, asking them what would be the most neutral way that we could introduce the topic. Basically, we wanted to ask a question: what comes to mind when you think about animal farming or blah, 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 blah. And based on some feedback, we got animals used for food. So our first question in all the interviews was, what comes to mind when you think about animals used for food? And again, our goal here was to be like the most kind of neutral, emotionally not charged message, like word. And it was amazing how much that language that we don't, I mean, it's not graphic. Like I think the slaughter and torture stuff maybe can bring up some of that defensiveness or that sense that it's like overly emotionally charged, and like histrionic is a word that I sometimes use for this in terms of how people like it. They just saw it as like people, we don't want to come across as like exaggerated, right? But animals used for food, when we looked back at it, we were like, oh, that's actually, because that's really describing like the relationship, right? I mean, we're using like it was very strong. People were like, they would hear that and they would say, oh. I mean, it's wrong. We shouldn't be doing it. Like, it's just amazing. Like all these mediators, like they would react so strongly to this language that we had kind of tried to, and in hindsight, maybe it wasn't the most neutral, but I would maybe make a case for that, talking about the use of animals for food, or because it doesn't have any charged language, but it gets right to the heart of it. And we found it to be pretty effective. So, I mean, I think there's a lot more room to continue to experiment with that. And there's different things to use in different settings. But anyway, sorry, Michelle, to interrupt. Let's actually wrap up.
Okay, no apologies necessary here at all. We could talk about this all night. We might need to do a part 2. There's some great comments in the chat, so how everybody is reading those, and Aidan can read those as well. Feel free to drop your information in the chat. But if everyone can hang in for just another 2 minutes, I just want to make some last sort of announcements regarding AAM and future stuff. Okay, so hold on one second, especially for those of you not as familiar with AAM. I wanted to announce, we have workshops regularly like this on Zoom. Our next workshop is next week, February 28th. We have Dharma Voices for Animals, which includes a guided Buddhist meditation designed for activists. On March 2nd, we have Resistance and Repression, how the government targets social movements and how we can fight back, with attorney Brad Thompson. And on Thursday, March 30th, we have Anthropomorphism as Activism with Karen Davis. On April 6th, we have Dominionism and Domestication, the history of animal exploitation with author Jim Mason. You can find, the event pages. If you follow us on Eventbrite, you'll get the announcements. You can also go to our social media for all of our workshops are posted there. And again, please check out previous workshops on our YouTube channel and subscribe while you're there. We appreciate that. And I want to announce our 2023 live events so that we can see each other in person, not just virtually. The AAM Washington, D.C. Week of Action is coming up, taking place March 14th through 20th, 2023. The Colorado Convergence is taking place in and around Denver. The dates are June 24th through July 1st. And the Ohio Occurrence is being held September 1st through 3rd in and around Cincinnati. Also, we have a live event. I don't have the dates, but Portland, Oregon. We're also going to have a live multi-day event in Portland, Oregon. Okay, so watch for that announcement coming up. No experience required, but registration is required. So you'll find the events on our Facebook page and website. So that wraps up another AAM workshop. Thank you, Aidan, for your time and wisdom. Big applause, everyone, please, for Aidan. Thank you all for being here and the tireless work you're doing for the animals. If you're interested in becoming a mentor or mentee or want to get involved, please reach out to any AAM mentor or visit our website, animalactivismmentorship.com. Please consider becoming a patron by finding AAM on Patreon. And if you'd like to be in our email newsletter list, if you're not already, please drop your email in the chat. And I will add you to our email newsletter list so you keep up to date on our announcement and what's going on. Okay, so until next time, everyone, stay strong and live vegan, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Come visit us in Colorado.
Yay.